Good evening. On behalf of the King's College, I would like to welcome you to tonight's webinar featuring author and journalist Peter Canelos. My name is David Tubbs, and I teach courses in politics and constitutional law at King's. Tonight's event is jointly sponsored by two academic centers at the King's College, the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute and the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience. All of the people affiliated with these two centers are delighted that Peter has accepted our invitation to speak about his wonderful new biography of Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan, who lived from 1833 to 1911 and was the first Supreme Court justice to affirm equal rights for Black Americans. The title of Peter's book is The Great Dissenter, the story of John Marshall Harlan, America's judicial hero. And its publication occurs at an especially favorable time, given the many recent conversations that have been taking place in our country about the history of race relations here. The format of tonight's event is as follows. In just a moment, my colleague, Professor Paul Glatter, will introduce Peter, who will then speak for approximately 35 to 40 minutes. Following Peter's talk, we will have Q&A before concluding at 7:30. And without further ado, I will now turn things over to my colleague, Professor Paul Glatter, who will introduce Peter Canelos.
Thanks, David. Just one word, two sentences about the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute. Our mission is to train students for careers in media. So we offer several academic programs in journalism for high school and college students, and we help sponsor events like this one. We're always delighted to have journalists like Peter speak to our campus community. So let me tell you a few things about Peter Canelos. He's managing editor for Enterprise at Politico, a publication hopefully many of you read. He oversees the site's magazine, investigative journalism, and major projects. He's also been Politico's executive editor, overseeing the newsroom during the 2016 presidential election. Before Politico, he spent most of his career at the Boston Globe, where at various points he oversaw the paper's editorial page, local news coverage, and its Washington, D.C. bureau. A few other bio details: he's a native of Boston, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Law School, education which I'm sure helped him report this book, which we look forward to hearing about. So Peter, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Glatter. Thank you so much, Professor Tubbs. It's a great honor to be here at the King's College. It's also an honor to be giving a lecture that's named for McCandlish Phillips. I well remember that name from my earliest reading of the New York Times. It was such a distinctive byline. It would sort of leap out at you from page one when I was a child, really. I'm very well acquainted with his decision to leave journalism and sort of pursue a life that he found consistent with his values. I think that the King's College is also a very appropriate place to talk about the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan and this book that I want to show you again here, The Great Dissenter, because in many ways the whole book is a search for the roots of wisdom in the law. It looks at one person who in our current day view got everything right in his time, from serving on the Supreme Court from 1877 until 1911. So the book is an exploration of what it is that made him wise in the eyes of history, and what made his colleagues less wise. And values are a significant part of that. Religious values are one part of the equation. He was a very deeply religious man, an elder in his Presbyterian church, very devout Christian. And I think that, his willingness to stake out different positions from his colleagues stemmed in part from his belief that we can do God's work here on earth. And that was, I think, part of his religious experience. He taught Sunday school for more than 30 years. But that's not the only source of values. He was a man who believed strongly in what we would call today American exceptionalism. He was born in 1833, where there were still some people from the Revolutionary War generation still alive. The oldest Americans could remember the Revolutionary War. And he understood very much innately that American democracy was a great experiment and a great reaction to the kind of monarchies and totalitarianism that dominated all other countries of the world. So he felt the wisdom of the founding fathers almost as though it was a kind of secular religion, and he really trusted those values. The third source of wisdom and source of his values was his personal experience. And as we'll see when we describe his life and career a little bit more fully, he's a perfect illustration of how what one does early in one's life has a sort of trial and error aspect to it, and can lead to much stronger, firmer feelings later in life that are a product of those experiences and a product of those lessons. So I'm sure a lot of you, when you came to hear me talk, were sort of thinking, John Marshall Harlan, who is he? We heard John Marshall's name. We know there was another Justice Harlan. There's a lot of people named Harlan and Marshall sort of in the firmament of the legal system. So I want to start off by just telling you why I think he's a significant figure. And that is that during the long period that he served on the Supreme Court from 1877 to 1911, which was about 150 years ago, several things happened during that era that we now consider very significant. You know, with the hindsight that comes from so much time, we understand what it was that was important, what it was that mattered during that period, and we understand what didn't matter. So one of the things that we think of from that period is that it was the start of segregation. And we now know that segregation, legal segregation, which bedeviled America for 100 years, and the after effects of which we are still contending with right now, was a disaster for American history. It's a terrible source of division. It impacts our lives today. We also know that during that period, which was known as the Gilded Age, there was tremendous income inequality. You know, on the one hand, we all go and visit mansions up the Hudson and in Newport and on Long Island, and in some cases out in the Berkshires, where the richest Americans built homes that were modeled on the chateau of French kings, of Louis XIV. And yet we also know that there were many workers, immigrant workers, who were living 4 and 5 to a room, even though they were all working, because they couldn't afford any place else to live. Now, if you ask yourself, how did these things happen? How did segregation under the law take hold, despite a constitution that explicitly promises equal protection under the law? How did that happen? And how did it happen that this historically significant income inequality took root and hurt people for so many years and wasn't unremedied in Harlan's time? And you look back and you say, well, the answer is that it wasn't that there was some terrible president during that time, and it wasn't that Congress was completely unresponsive, because Congress did respond to these problems. Congress actually passed a Civil Rights Act in 1875 that guaranteed Black people rights to equal access of transportation and accommodations. Instead, the blame should go to the Supreme Court. On the side of segregation, the Supreme Court declared that Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. It explicitly refused to enforce voting rights, even though the 15th Amendment to the Constitution is all about voting rights. In the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, it endorsed the legal architecture of segregation, allowing terrible inequalities to exist. On the economic side, Congress actually passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional initially. It also passed an income tax, which was seen as a much fairer way to fund the government than tariffs, which applied the same premium on basic goods. So the poor and the rich paid the same. But the income tax was declared unconstitutional. Then in the case of Lochner v. New York, there was a decision saying that state legislatures could not legislate to protect workers per se, that any law passed in the name of labor relations was per se unconstitutional. The common thread in all of those cases that I just described is that John Marshall Harlan dissented. He dissented forcefully. In many of those cases, the majority of the cases that I just mentioned, he was the sole dissenter. Now, all of those cases are considered abominations. When you study law, they're explicitly declared to be wrong-headed decisions, no matter whether your professor is an arch-conservative or an arch-liberal or anywhere in between. We consider these decisions to be wrongly decided, and we consider Harlan's dissents to be correct. So, how did John Harlan get everything right in a time when his colleagues were getting everything wrong? This is a much deeper story that goes into his past and into the very foundation of his life story in Kentucky, where he was born in 1833. At that time, there was one terrible shadow over his life and over the lives of other Kentuckians, and that was the threat of civil war. It's from the compromise of from the Missouri Compromise in 1830 through other efforts to try to forestall the war that so many people saw coming, Kentuckians played the lead, and there was a reason for that. Kentuckians played the lead because they feared that their state would be destroyed by this war, that geographically it would be destroyed because it stood between North and South. Politically, it would be destroyed because its sentiments were divided between North and South and between slavery and freedom. So from the earliest age, John Harlan was aware of this terrible threat to the country. At the same time as he's learning about the marvelous wisdom of the founding fathers, and he learned this from his own father, who was the leading lawyer in Kentucky and had the leading private law library in Kentucky. And it was almost that secular religion. But that secular religion was under siege because on both sides, you could see states' rights activists in the South promoting secession, and you could see abolitionists in the North demanding the freedom of slaves, which would cause the South to fight. So that's why John Marshall Harlan, his father James Harlan, Henry Clay, who was a mentor to him, that's why they fought for all of these compromises. And yet, all of that came to naught when the US Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, went beyond the facts of the case, which was about a fugitive slave who tried to sue for freedom after living many years in the North. They went beyond the facts of the case to declare that the US Constitution would never recognize the rights of Black people, even free Black people. Declared that right from the start, racism was embedded in the American Constitution, never any contemplation of Black rights. That was wrong. At the time, 5 states had equal rights for Black people, and there was no contemplation of keeping Black people out of the constitutional framework. But this activist Supreme Court thought that it was doing something that would prevent the war by providing a sort of definitive answer. The lesson that it gave to John Harlan was about the awe-inspiring power of the Supreme Court and the way that the finality of a court decision can weigh on the United States for years. I think at that moment, he realized that all those compromises that had been pursued, the Missouri Compromise from before he was born, compromises designed to limit the geographic spread of slavery, compromises designed to provide popular sovereignty over slavery, compromises that his father had sought to pursue that involved colonization of freed slaves, possible compensation of slave owners. All of those compromises would be nullified by this very, very bad Supreme Court decision. It made a very strong impression on him. Something else made a strong impression on him from his upbringing, and that was the presence in his home of an enslaved man who was treated more like a family member. And he was 16 years older than John. And he was a man of mixed race. And his name was Robert Harlan. And Robert Harlan's background must have been a tremendous source of mystery to John. We know because Robert Harlan became a famous man in his own right later in his life, and there were many newspaper profiles that were written about him. So we know that he was born in a place called Mecklenburg County, Virginia, born enslaved, to a mother who was herself of mixed race and enslaved. And this county was where John's grandmother, James Harlan's mother's family, had been from. And yet when Robert was 8 years old, he and his mother undertook a journey 450 miles through wilderness, what was then wilderness, to Kentucky. And most of the news reports said that they were going to Kentucky to find his father. And they went to this tiny hamlet called Harlans Station that was essentially a family town. And Robert became the property of James Harlan. Now, from that, many people extrapolated, including many people in the town and in the community, extrapolated that Robert was the son of James Harlan, born before his marriage to John's mother, Eliza. Other people, I'm sure it was not talked about. It was just a mysterious presence. At that time in American history, there were light-skinned enslaved people on plantations, and people were left to speculate about their parentage. What was different in this case was that Robert Harlan really was treated like a son and really regarded James Harlan as a father. And James Harlan, in fact, tried to educate Robert Harlan, but he was rejected because of his race. Despite that blow, and it was a significant blow because James Harlan, the possessor of the largest private law library in Kentucky, envisioned his sons, all of his sons, to be candidates to work in a family law firm. And from the earliest age, he had them learning the law at an age when most kids are learning ABCs. But Robert couldn't be taught because of his race. In a paradoxical way, that freed him up to live a more adventurous life than John and his brothers lived. Robert developed this unusual ability to find ways and find places where Black people could succeed, even against the greatest odds known to mankind. And being enslaved has to count as that, the greatest odds against you at any moment. One of those opportunities was in horse racing, which is now the statewide sport of Kentucky, but at the time was just developing. They were living in the central bluegrass area, which was the leading horse racing capital of Kentucky. And at that time, Black people played a large role in the development of horse racing. This is partly because some of the early horse owners were themselves slave owners, and enslaved men served as trainers and jockeys. Early accounts of that period described the scene at these racing meets as being like a checkerboard, black and white, in equal measure. Robert Harlan surmised as a very young man that this was a place where he could make his mark. And he, in fact, became famous from an early age of being able to size up a horse's prospects just by looking at it. And for the rest of his life, he was a fixture at racetracks across the country and nationally famous as a horse racing expert. But that was just the start for Robert. Trying to envision his early life, he was 16 years older than John. I want to paint a little picture of what he must have meant to young John Harlan watching Robert Harlan. You know, John was 5 and 6 years old, maybe even 7 or 8. Robert was living in the same house, but would come back on his horse at night with a leather pouch full of winnings from these races that he had stayed. Almost certainly carrying a gun because you needed to, enforce the betting rules to keep these races going. Robert was known as being tremendously handsome and charismatic. He was this sort of raffish figure coming back to the Harlan family, while John and his brothers were in this sort of cloistered study of the law. So Robert loomed as kind of this charismatic uncle figure to John. Robert left the family in 1849 when he heard about the gold rush and rushed himself to California to be one of the earliest people to take advantage of this opportunity. It was another place where racism would not hold him back. He knew instinctively that people were coming from all around the world, from Asia, from Europe, even from Africa, try to find gold in California. It was too new an environment for the old prejudices to take hold. So he got on a boat all the way down the Mississippi, then went from New Orleans to Panama City, crossed Panama, which is mountainous rainforest region, portaging canoes across to the far coast, the western coast of Panama, picking up a rickety boat, passing over these dangerous straits to get to San Francisco. And there we know he made the equivalent of $4 or $5 million in today's money. Most likely he made it through selling products in a vastly inflated environment. He may also have done some prospecting on his own, but he came back a rich man. Far richer, it should be noted. The $4 or $5 million went a lot further then than it would now in a very different America. But he did something smart with that too. He moved to Cincinnati, which is at that time was the terminus of the Underground Railroad. Large free state and free city for African Americans. And he invested in Black-owned businesses. Those were as simple as a grocer, but as complicated as creating a photo studio that nurtured some of the nation's leading photography pioneers who happened to be African Americans in Cincinnati. He had actually taken a trip to Europe and seen some early photography from Cincinnati in the Crystal Palace exhibit in London, and recognized that this new technology, just like the gold rush and just like horse racing, was something which was too new to be encrusted with the old prejudices. And he funded some of these photographers who are now considered great pioneers. He also held the mortgage in a place called the Dumas House, which was the leading Black hostelry in Cincinnati. It was a place where free Black people coming off of steamboats with some money would sit in the front room and play cards on these sort of velvet top tables. But behind, in this sort of catacombs-like basement, they would hide fugitive slaves. And Robert Harlan owned the mortgage of the Dumas House and was in every sense the leading Black citizen of Cincinnati. He spent the Civil War years in Europe because he had this sort of showman sense that he could bring 3 champion racehorses that he owned over to England and challenge British racers and make some money in these races as a transatlantic challenge. Americans showing their equality in what was then the sport of kings, still the sport of kings in England. He didn't win a lot of races, but he did become famous in England and is still the subject. You go back and look at some of these news clips, and Robert Harlan was a very well-known person, not just in England, but in all of Europe as he traveled all around Europe. Then he came back after the Civil War and became the leading Black politician in Cincinnati and began a political career of his own. John Harlan, when we last left him, was despairing over what was to happen after the Dred Scott decision. He was himself a man in his early to mid-20s at the time, but already promising in politics in Kentucky, traveling around the state, delivering speeches, considered a figure of deep, passionate feelings and charisma and authenticity as a voice of the bluegrass state. And he was somebody that people listened to despite his young age. So when Kentucky confronted the crisis of the coming Civil War, when its governor was a Confederate sympathizer and many other leaders in society, Kentucky society, wanted to side with the South, John Harlan literally took a bullhorn and went to the streets of Louisville to urge and implore his fellow Kentuckians to stay loyal to the Union. Eventually, he played a key role in hammering out Kentucky's neutrality, which was absolutely crucial to helping the Union. And eventually, Kentucky rejoined the Union early in the Civil War. Harlan had to do many things that were incredibly challenging to him. Here he was, a man of the law, a man of education, and he had to become a man of action. The Lincoln administration, which had very little support in Kentucky, was fearful that the Confederacy would try to sort of settle the deal by just taking Kentucky by force, but sent what was called the Lincoln guns, these crates full of rifles, to Kentucky. And John Harlan and his father, James, and the Speed brothers, Joshua and James Speed, who were close friends of Lincoln, were the people who received and hid these weapons to protect the state in the event of a Confederate attack. John Harlan also slept on the floor of the Kentucky legislature because he was afraid that Confederates would be cutting deals in the middle of the night to persuade legislative leaders to join the rebellion. Then he himself raised a regiment of Kentuckians to fight for the Union, became a colonel, and saw considerable action for 2 years in a pretty much near constantly being on the move in the Union Army. He described stepping over dead bodies at Shiloh, saw every negative effect of the war. He took his men through cities and towns where they were greeted by African Americans who were hung outside as symbols of what would be done to Yankees. It was a horrible experience seeing war. It was horrible for him. It was horrible for many others of his generation, but it added to that powerful sense of experience that he would later bring to the Supreme Court. But first, he also had another political crisis of his own. He had been elected the Attorney General for Kentucky in 1864, near the end of the war. You remember he had been, carrying that bullhorn around Louisville, persuading people to stay loyal to the Union, and felt that he had a personal commitment from the Lincoln administration to allow Kentucky to choose its own path after the war, including on issues like slavery. He felt that Kentucky had earned that. He felt that he had promised that to his neighbors and friends. Instead, the Lincoln administration and the Andrew Johnson administration after it kept Kentucky under martial law. Now, it must be said there were good reasons for it to be under martial law. It was sort of a hotbed of rebellion, even though it was still loyal to the Union. But in John Harlan's mind and that of many other Kentuckians, martial law went too far. There were a series of brutal military commanders who were deeply, deeply unpopular and accused of atrocities in the state. They also ruled essentially as dictators in the state. He felt that as Attorney General, but also as one of the people who had urged Kentucky to stay loyal to the Union, he had an obligation to fight back. During that period, he also had resisted calls for Kentucky to immediately ratify the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution, which were designed to protect freed slaves. The reason he opposed it was that he was hoping that Kentucky could choose its own path through plebiscite, perhaps envisioning that that emancipation could come through the will of the people in Kentucky and therefore have a stronger popular support. That didn't work. In fact, what happened was the post-Civil War amendments were ratified anyway, and the Ku Klux Klan emerged. Various white gangs emerged that later became part of the Ku Klux Klan and asserted power in Kentucky and committed terrible atrocities, mostly to African Americans, but to white people as well. Created this sort of lawless Kentucky of the Hatfields and McCoys that we may think about of lore. For Harlan, as sort of a patriot and a loyal Kentuckian, this was horrifying, and the rejection of the rule of law was horrifying. And it brought about a tremendous political change. Even though almost nobody in Kentucky supported the Republican Party, which was then under the control of the so-called radical Republicans, who were demanding concessions from the South and deeper commitments from the South in terms of support of civil rights, Harlan embraced that position. He was one of very few Kentuckians to do so. And he was personally popular in Kentucky, so he started preaching this Republican ideology and this Republican message, and had some success in Kentucky, even though it was very much of a lost cause right from the start. At that moment, he developed a national reputation as a forceful, articulate spokesperson of Republican values in a state where those values were not shared and not embraced widely. Pretty soon, by 1876, when there was a disputed election in the presidential race, Harlan was one of the few people in the South, or it was considered the South, who was seen as being supportive of civil rights. Rutherford Hayes became president in that disputed election, partly because Republicans controlled all the aspects of government and were able to sort of tip the scales in his favor. But in the process of doing so, they also cut a series of behind-the-scenes deals in lobbies and smoke-filled rooms designed to appease democratic Southerners and try to bring the country together. One of those deals was to appoint a Southerner to the Supreme Court, which had been all Northerners at that period. Nonetheless, the Senate Judiciary Committee was under the control of these so-called radical Republicans. So they had to figure out, Hayes had to figure out, somebody who was credible enough as a Southerner, but also supportive enough of civil rights to be confirmed. That brought Harlan to his attention. Nonetheless, many of those Northerners distrusted Harlan because he had come from a slave-owning family. He was not an abolitionist before the war. He had been slow to embrace the post-Civil War Amendments. And even though he had had this big conversion and gone around preaching Republican ideology, there was some distrust whether these values were real or somehow expedient in him. That was a time when Robert Harlan, the man who grew up in his home, came to his aid. There were many things that Robert Harlan did to help John Harlan politically during that time, but one of them was simply going to Washington and advocating for Harlan. So if you envision John Harlan facing the skepticism of the Senate Judiciary Committee, does he really believe in civil rights? And yet the leading Black politician in Ohio at a time when Blacks had real clout in the Republican Party, Black voters had clout in the Republican Party. He grew up in the same house as John Harlan and attested to John Harlan's true values. That, I think, made a difference. We can never know how much of a difference it made, but Robert Harlan was there supporting John Harlan. He did get confirmed to the Supreme Court. For 6 years, he was sort of the junior member of the Supreme Court. In 1883, he faced his first crisis on the Supreme Court. That was the case of the civil rights cases of 1883. As we had mentioned earlier, I mentioned earlier, Congress had passed a Civil Rights Act in 1875 that said that if you are an innkeeper, if you're a restaurateur, if you run a railroad, if you operate a stagecoach, you had to give Black people equal access. But there were many people in the South and North that just refused to abide by this. Cases began piling up. They were all compiled and put together into one massive case that went before the Supreme Court. This was a national requiem almost on racial issues. It was such big news that like theater productions in the South were interrupted to give updates of what was going on in the Supreme Court. It was a matter of such urgent concern. It was a crucial moment because all of those Northern justices who had their impeccable abolitionist credentials and who saw themselves as supporters of freedom suddenly alighted on this position that there was no way that the federal government could enforce civil rights because these post-Civil War amendments only applied to state action. And if you were somebody running a restaurant or an inn or a railroad or a stagecoach, you aren't the state, you're an individual. You can discriminate, the state can't discriminate. Therefore, this law has to go, and we're gonna have peace between the North and the South. John Harlan felt in his bones that something was wrong. It was a deeply troubling period in his life. We talk again about sort of values and religious influences. His eldest daughter, eldest of 6 children, died shortly after giving birth to a child during that period. And John Harlan wrote to his sons who were in college that he would spend every day for the rest of his life trying to live up to the values of this wonderful young woman who had been the centerpiece of their family life, the heart and soul of the Harlan family. It happened that one of her charity interests was teaching children of newly freed slaves at the Bethel Industrial School, which was part of the predecessor church to Metropolitan AME in Washington, which is now still the largest and in some ways the most prominent African-American church in Washington. That may have had an influence on him. His own daughter believed in Black equality and believed in elevating the children of the newly freed men and women. Also, John Harlan had been there, as had all of his colleagues, when these amendments were passed. He knew what they meant. He knew what they meant because he was the Attorney General of Kentucky. And what they were intended to do was to elevate Black people to a full state of citizenship. It created the idea of a national citizenship for the first time. That was the whole point of these amendments. That was why people held out for the South to ratify these amendments before allowing former Confederates back into the voting rolls and into full citizenship. We also know that the plain language of these amendments declared that. They said equal protection under the law. No rights can be taken away without due process under the law. Slavery or any badges of slavery, unconstitutional. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court majority had come up through what Harlan called this sort of ingenious construction, a way of refuting not just the will of the people, but the Constitution, which was the law of the land, the bedrock of American democracy, was being thwarted by the court majority. And he wouldn't stand for it. There was a lot of pressure to have a unanimous decision in something that was this important. But Harlan delivered an opinion that was a long opinion, a long dissenting opinion that was an intriguing mix of sort of high values and legal analysis. In the high value part, he called out his colleagues for their unfairness. Justice Joseph Philo Bradley, who wrote the majority opinion, had said, there must come a time in the life of any race where it takes the ranks of mere citizens and ceases to be the special favorites of the law. John Harlan shot back, it is scarcely fair to say that Black people have been the special favorites of the law. Unbelievable that Justice Bradley was saying that at a time when the Ku Klux Klan was lynching people and running rampant, and when people had just come out of slavery 12 years earlier. Unbelievable, or 12 or 15 years earlier. Harlan also, however, in that opinion, crafted legal principles that pointed the way to a different outcome, a different interpretation for the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, but also the use of Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce to enforce civil rights, which ultimately in 1965 became the basis for overturning the civil rights cases of 1883. After that, Harlan became a regular dissenter on the Supreme Court, standing up for Black people in a way that I think was quite extraordinary. He also stood up for other racial minorities under the law. When the insular cases came along, which were the cases that governed the Philippines and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Cuba, which had come under American control, John Harlan was the leading proponent of the idea that the Constitution must follow the flag, that if you're under American control, you're under the supremacy of the Constitution and you should be granted full constitutional rights. His colleagues refused to go along with that. He also dissented strongly in a case involving a Native American who left his tribal nation and tried to assert birthright citizenship in the United States. The court's majority said, no, can't be declared an American because he was born in another nation, in this tribal nation. Harlan declared, we cannot have this group of stateless people living in the United States, and he must be considered an American by birth. But most of his advocacy was for African Americans. There was a case involving voting rights. The state of Alabama passed a constitution that grandfathered in all white voters, essentially all descendants of Confederates and other men of means, white men of means, but granted powers to voting clerks to reject people on the evidence of bad character, or with no evidence of bad character, just declaring them to be a bad character. So all these Black people, thousands of Black people who had voted before, were suddenly stripped off the rolls because of their supposedly bad character. 5,000 of them who had voted before paid all their taxes, even the poll taxes, passed all the literacy tests, challenged that to the Supreme Court. In the majority opinion, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that it was clear, plainly clear, the state of Alabama was trying to disenfranchise Black people, and that this was unconstitutional. But he said, what can we, the Supreme Court, do about it? We have no enforcement mechanism. If we were to give the remedy that these plaintiffs are asking for, which is to be registered as voters, we would merely be adding more names to an illegal and unlawful voting scheme. Therefore, the solution had to be in politics. The Supreme Court could do nothing about it. It was a rather shocking decision that's gotten very little attention these days. John Harlan dissented and said these people should be registered to vote. In Plessy v. Ferguson, coming in 1896, 13 years after Harlan's first big break with his colleagues, Harlan wrote what is ultimately would become his most memorable dissent. This was the case of the so-called Louisiana Car Law, which kept Black and white people in separate railroad cars. It was the genesis of segregation, or the finest expression of segregation, however you want to look at it. And the state asserted this doctrine of separate but equal that acknowledged that the Supreme Court called for equal protection under the laws, but it said, okay, we're providing equal space for Blacks, equal space for white. Once again, John Harlan called out his colleagues for siding with that, falling for that, coming up with blatantly false and unlawful justifications for it. The justice who wrote the majority opinion, Henry Billings Brown, declared if there's any discrimination in this process, it's because Black people themselves put that construction on the law. The law itself is entirely equal. Harlan said, no one in America would be so wanting in candor as to say that the purpose of this law was to treat people equally. The purpose of the law was to separate African Americans. Harlan also wrote with a sort of trenchant nature and sort of almost anger of the man who for 13 years had been fighting these battles. And he reached back into sort of the foundational principles of American democracy. He wrote the line, "The Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. There is no caste here." These are the kind of sentiments that can and should be etched on the walls of buildings. And those of you who've studied law know that it's rather rare for judicial opinions to go that deep into the foundational principles of American life to settle a case. Harlan's dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson got very little attention in the mainstream media at the time. But we know now, because African-American newspapers have been digitized in the last 10 or 15 years, that they got a tremendous amount of attention in the Black community. We know also that when Harlan died in 1911, there were spontaneous memorial services in cities all across the country, cities where Harlan had never even visited. All at Black churches, 100% Black attendees, mourning this person they had never met, but who they recognized as their sole defender in the white power structure. In Washington, D.C., there were 3 of those services that culminated in a sort of joint memorial service at Metropolitan AME, which is the largest church, and one where Harlan had spoken many times before and had this connection because of his late daughter. At that service, Harlan's dissents were read aloud. And if you put yourself in the mind of a young person in that audience, hearing the words of John Harlan, "The Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens, the humblest peer of the most powerful," you can begin to understand the difference that he made to that generation. Thurgood Marshall, who we now recognize as the greatest civil rights lawyer of the 20th century, was born shortly after that. And he immediately adopted Harlan as his role model and a figure of courage. And he used Harlan's dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson as a tool for recruiting plaintiffs to challenge segregation. Harlan had created the idea that there was at least one white person who was capable of seeing the law through the eyes of African Americans, understanding the deep injustice that was being done to Black people. So when Thurgood Marshall had to recruit plaintiffs to challenge these laws, plaintiffs who knew in their local small towns and communities that the Ku Klux Klan was taking names and waiting for them, he had to persuade them there was some hope. And Harlan's dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson gave them some hope. It also gave them some legal principles to rely on, and they quoted that opinion in all of their legal briefs challenging segregation, up to and including Brown versus Board of Education, which finally overruled legal segregation and overruled Plessy v. Ferguson in 1954. So that's why I think people today should know more about the John Harlan story. They should know it because at this darkest moment in American law, when the Supreme Court was doing terrible things that hurt Americans' lives and really took away the rights and hopes of millions and millions of Americans, not just the African Americans, but in the economic cases, those of us who come from immigrant backgrounds, it was our great-grandparents and grandparents who were affected. It was other poor people and people seeking justice in all corners of the United States that were affected by these Supreme Court decisions. Harlan was this lone voice of sanity. And I think that when we look back and say, why was he this lone voice of sanity? Several things do stand out. His understanding at a very personal level of African Americans, which takes you back to his relationship with Robert Harlan, but also his relationship with Frederick Douglass, his relationship with other Black people, his willingness to extend himself and go to seminars at Metropolitan AME and other Black churches, his willingness to live a multiracial life. Also, the experience of compromise and all that desperate time trying to avoid the Civil War gave him a sense of the stakes in these Supreme Court decisions. So too the Dred Scott decision showed him what can happen when the Supreme Court gets it wrong. When you have understood, have lived through those kinds of experiences, when you also have fought in a war and seen people die, you can't so easily go along and get along, view it all as a matter of kind of politics and negotiation. You have to speak out, you have to make a stand. And that's something that Harlan experienced. All of those life experiences combine to make what I consider a great justice, certainly a great dissenter, certainly a great role model. And that's why I'm so pleased that people here at the King's College are interested in hearing about Harlan. And I hope that those of you who are there in the audience can enjoy the book and view him as a positive figure in our history and experience.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that very inspiring talk. And as I announced at the beginning, we have time for question and answers with the audience. But as a professional courtesy, I'd like to ask my colleague, Professor Paul Glatter, if you'd like to ask a relatively brief question for Peter based on his talk. Anything you'd like to ask, Professor Glatter?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, I think we're, Dr. Tubbs and I are ordering some books to surprise some students who attended here. So you may receive one. You might be the lucky winner. Thanks for this wonderful talk, Peter. My question was, in your research here, did you discover any flaws about this person who you call a hero? He is a hero, but what kind of flaws did you find? And in an age where, it's easy to demonize others, are there any lessons in sort of the flaws and the heroic parts of his life that we can learn from today when we analyze him as a whole person?
Yeah, I think it's very important to see these figures as whole people, and also to understand that we can honor people for what we feel are their very significant contributions, while also acknowledging times when they weren't right. And I think that many people will say John Harlan was slow to embrace the post-Civil War amendments. As was noted at the time of his confirmation, he was not an abolitionist before the Civil War. He was a critic of slavery, but he clearly would have accepted the continuation of slavery as the price of peace, with some idea that it eventually would have been eradicated. But he was not demanding an immediate end to slavery. Also, later in his judicial career, there were several decisions that have been criticized. I think that in some cases that they're a little bit harder to understand. One of them was the Chinese exclusion case, where he joined a 9-0 majority in the Supreme Court that allowed the law that ended Chinese migration to the United States. And some people have pointed to that as a flaw in his civil rights resume. While it was an objectionable opinion written by Justice Stephen Field, it was not written by Harlan, the underlying legal issue in that case was simply whether Congress had the power to cancel a treaty because Chinese were not here as citizens or as conventional immigrants. They were here as guest workers under a treaty that had been approved by the Senate, but they remained subjects of the Chinese emperor. Now, out of that, you can extrapolate what was Harlan thinking about when that was going on. I think he was thinking, first of all, that if the only legal issue is can Congress abrogate a treaty, of course, Congress needs to have the power to abrogate a treaty. And to this day, that part of the decision is good law. But I also think that it connected with something in Harlan where he believed so strongly in American democracy and in American exceptionalism that at various points in his life, he expressed skepticism about whether people who lived under monarchies, or in the case of Catholic immigrants, lived under the doctrine of papal infallibility, could in fact be good Democrats. And he wrestled with those questions earlier in his life. Later in his life, and by later I mean even as early as his 30s, he pointed out there were two Catholic priests that were in his regiment in the Civil War and were great patriots, and that persuaded him that Catholics would be great Americans and caused him. Much later in his life, he rejected any sense of anti-immigrant feeling because he had briefly been part of the American Party, which was called the Know Nothings, which had sort of succeeded the Whigs in Kentucky. And while he did not campaign on anti-immigrant issues, there was certainly an anti-immigrant aspect to the American Party platform. And he strongly repudiated it later in his life, to the point of even, throwing his father under the bus by saying that he only did it because his father insisted that he do it. So, are there perfect people in the world? No. Are there people who live in American politics who, if we scrutinize what they say and what they do, we not find things that are less flattering? I don't think there's anybody who fits that bill, but I think the fact that Harlan was an imperfect person and that earlier in his life he took some positions that are problematic and were subject to challenge even then, and then emerged in a totally different skin later in his life as the great defender of African American rights. I think it shows how people can change and improve, and how we grow and learn. And his progress through life was not particularly different than Abraham Lincoln's. Abraham Lincoln was also a supporter of Henry Clay and supporter of compromises leading up to the Civil War, who later took stronger stands. I think Harlan came to believe that inequality under the law was a terrible sin that almost destroyed the American experiment in its cradle and caused the Civil War. And that's why in things like the Insular cases involving the rights of Puerto Ricans and Filipinos and Hawaiians, he didn't want to allow a system to develop where anybody living under the American flag had any less rights than any other American. So he really was the true apostle and a legitimate apostle of equality under the law.
Thank you. Thank you for that question and that answer. A question is coming from the audience, Peter. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. It's a question about Harlan's great achievement as the sole dissenter in the civil rights cases in Plessy versus Ferguson. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but what do you think are the two or three most important factors behind Harlan's courage to dissent, to be the solitary dissenter, and getting it right in a way that, as you said in your talk, people today look at this and they say, one justice on the Supreme Court got it right. And so this question is about what are the two or three most important factors that explain the courage to go against the rest of the court, to stand alone, and to assert an unpopular position.
Yeah, I think the factors that go into that are some of the things that we talked about, like his religious values. I think if you believe that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and that there's a moral dimension to these judicial decisions, and that we on earth can do God's work here, I think that gives you the courage to stand up. I also think that as a pragmatic matter, as I mentioned at the end of the talk, when you have seen people die, when you've seen the cost of some of these decisions, you can't go along and get along. So I think he was comfortable dissenting more strongly. I also think that within his generation, because people had to take these tough stances surrounding the Civil War, it was probably a little bit more understood that he was able to take these strong stances. I think that in terms of what it was that made him right instead of making him wrong, I think that his close associations with African Americans and willingness to actually meet and hear the opinions of Black people, which those Northern whites with their sterling credentials didn't have, I think that made a big difference. I also think that he was less affected by economic concerns than the Northerners. After the Civil War, there was a tremendous economic boom in the North. And I think that many of the Northern justices, I mean, almost all of the Northern justices, were corporate attorneys who had sort of gotten rich representing railroad interests, representing combinations that had been challenged under the law. And I think that they believed in an economic destiny for the United States. And they felt that, decades had been spent in this sectional dispute over slavery, and it couldn't be allowed to continue. So I think in their mind, in the civil rights cases of 1883 and in Plessy v. Ferguson, they were almost deliberately sort of looking the other way at these injustices being visited on Black people and sort of saying, enough. We've fought these battles for decades. We've paid the price through the Civil War. We're not going to do it again. And I think Harlan came from Kentucky, where, for one thing, the economy wasn't that great, and the influence of corporate titans wasn't that great, and wealth, he was not wealthy. So he looked at things with a very different set of eyes.
Very good. A question that I think is asked in earnest, and I'm going to modify it slightly. The question is, what would be the ideal way for a student to become acquainted with Harlan? I think I could answer that by saying, by this book, by your biography.
Well, and that is true. And there's another reason. You can read his dissents. I mean, they're very accessible, and he's speaking in a different voice than the majority opinion in most of these cases. So that's what stood out to me. When I was a law student in the late 1980s, I first became interested in Harlan just because I read the dissents. So that would be my advice, but also read the book.
So could I ask you, this is a continuation of that question. So you read these cases in Harlan's Dissents as a student in law school. And then what prompted you later in life to go back to them? What prompted you to think about the possibility of doing a biography of him? You're very accomplished.
I will say that
this is a bold project, right?
Yeah, all those questions that I mentioned about, wow, here's a guy who sort of got everything right, and how did he manage to do it? Were very much in my mind, but they were in my mind only in the way that, when you're a student, there's people that you're curious about. There are things that sort of stand out a little bit in your mind, and Harlan's role in the court certainly did. Then in 2005, I was the Washington bureau chief for the Boston Globe, and we were covering the nominations of Roberts and Alito to the Supreme Court, which happened pretty much concurrently. And I read a legal encyclopedia entry, was reading several legal encyclopedia entries in the course of editing some of those stories, and one of them was of Harlan, and there was the one sentence in it that said, he was presumed to be the half-brother of Robert Harlan, the leading Black politician in Ohio. And it was then that I began to think that there was something more interesting in the Harlan backstory that would help explain some of these positions that he took on the court. And I wanted to do the book as soon as 2009, but all these other, career and professional opportunities sort of got in the way, and I really wasn't able to really concentrate on it until 2017. But by waiting so long, I sort of had the story in my mind. I knew the cases that I wanted to write about. I knew what I wanted to do. And I was also able to draw on, after 2017, the work of some excellent young researchers who can help people. My generation was great on the internet to find some of these sources, some of these newly digitized sources that we relied on.
Very good. Here's a question about the contemporary situation in the United States with respect to one part of the Black experience. What do you think Harlan would say about the desire on the part of some American Blacks to kind of separate from white people? Requests to live separately, say in college dorms, to have separate graduations in different schools. what do you think Harlan might say about that if he
Well,
saw
I think he'd be understanding of it because that was the norm in his era, and I don't think he viewed every form of separate activity to be a product of legal segregation. And I think he understood certainly that the Black experience in America was something that was a distinct set of experiences that people carried with them and would want to share with others who came out of the same historical story. So I think he would be tolerant and understanding of it. I think that if he felt that there was a legal dimension to it, that there was some degree of legal separation, he would take note of it. People have asked, well, what about affirmative action? And it's sort of unknowable what his stance on affirmative action would be. I know that Thurgood Marshall, who was a big admirer of Harlan's, was challenged once and asked that question in 1987. And he said Harlan would support affirmative action because he would understand that if he had been listened to in 1896 in the Supreme Court, by the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson, there would have been equality under the law and there'd be no need for affirmative action. Because no one listened to Harlan, there is a need for affirmative action. I don't have a personal view on exactly how he would come down on that question. People can debate it rather interestingly, but I think that he would have drawn a distinction between legal segregation and equality under the law and other forms of separate activities that especially when conducted by African Americans, he would be very understanding of.
There's a question here about Harlan's relationship with other justices on the Supreme Court over the course of his long career on the court. Did you indicated in your talk there's some disagreements, philosophic disagreements. Did he have cordial relations with the other justices when he's the solitary dissenter in civil rights cases in Plessy and in some of the other cases you mentioned? Do you have cordial relations? Do you have evidence that he, on some important issues, influenced any of the other justices?
There are some examples of him influencing some of the other justices, and I can mention a couple of cases. There was one race case where he joined the majority, perhaps to steer the decision in a direction that was much more moderate than the court would otherwise have gone. So people have sometimes asked, great that he was a dissenter, but why didn't he sort of stick with the majority and try to mitigate the dangers in some of these cases? And he did in a few instances. Also, I had mentioned the declaration that the Sherman Antitrust Act was unconstitutional in a case called E.C. Knight. Harlan was the sole dissenter in that decision. But by the time he died, which was about 15 years later, the court had really changed its position. Even some of the same justices had come around to his view. So that was one illustration of the court actually being influenced by his opinions. In general, he had cordial relations with his colleagues, and he did not fit what you might consider the usual profile of a dissenter. We think of people who have taken very strong stances against the majority. There's an element of outcast to them, and he was not an outcast. He was somebody who had a very happy marriage. He had very functional relationships with his children and loving relationships with his children, large extended family, a sense of pride in his job and his country and all that. So in general, he had good relations with his colleagues, but there were some points of contention in that the case involving the income tax being declared unconstitutional. He showed a lot of emotion on the bench and shook his fist in the direction of Justice Field and got criticized for being overheated a little bit. But in general, he was very, very cordial and affable.
Okay. A closely related question just came in. Did he bear any costs for the stands that he took, particularly in Plessy and the civil rights cases? He's a solitary dissenter. You said he had cordial relations with the other justices. Did he or his family bear any costs for those dissents?
Well, very, very interestingly, there were a lot of people, including African Americans in his time, including Frederick Douglass, who wrote that Harlan's courage and expressed this many times, that Harlan's courage in dissenting in the civil rights cases of 1883 was extraordinary. And Black people in particular always referred to Harlan as taking this courageous stance. And in some ways, what comes across is that leaders of the Black community really believed that there was a sort of monolithic consensus among white people to keep them out. They almost saw it as a conspiracy, and they saw Harlan as rejecting the conspiracy, and they saw that as an extraordinary act of courage. And there was a presumption in Black people describing it that Harlan was paying a terrible cost, that he was an outcast, that he would be widely criticized. And it's possible that he was not. He did not keep a voluminous amount of his correspondence for posterity. So it's possible that he was getting a lot of hate letters and criticisms and stuff. If he was, I think he probably acted it with some degree of equanimity because he had been in politics at a very dangerous time when people were making lots of allegations against each other. So I think he was a little thick-skinned about it. I think that another cost, though, that he incurred was to his reputation. At the time that he died, and for maybe 50 years afterwards, he was considered an eccentric, outlying, odd character, which was the last way that he would have wanted to be remembered. But he was vindicated over time, and he's not. People don't think of him that way at all anymore.
I sometimes say to my students that my interpretation of Plessy versus Ferguson is that it's the death knell of Reconstruction. My interpretation, this is it. This is really like the last hope to salvage key aspects of Reconstruction. So one question is asking indirectly, did Harlan, before he died, have any hope that Plessy might be revisited and overruled? Did that ever come up?
I think he believed strongly in the idea of posthumous vindication and talked even once in a lecture about what it meant to live after you die. So I think he did believe that his rightness would be affirmed by history and that he would be vindicated by history. I think that when he died, he viewed his dissent in the civil rights cases as his proudest moment. Plessy was not the big deal then that it is now. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he was very proud of his Plessy dissent, but he really viewed his civil rights cases of 1883 as being the crucible in his life and the time when he broke with his colleagues. And some of his colleagues who disagreed with him, like Henry Billings Brown, who wrote the majority opinion in Plessy, wrote about how all Harlan's life he would express with pride his dissent in the civil rights cases. David Brewer, also another colleague, pointed out that Harlan even he lived for 28 years beyond the civil rights cases of 1883, but never lost his sense of pride in his dissent in that case.
And was he more proud of it because he thought the issues were more consequential, that if you had federal legislation to support the rights of newly freed Blacks, if you had federal legislation giving them access to all places of public accommodation, that would have essentially changed the texture of American life for everyone, including Black Americans?
I don't know if that's the case. I think that part of the thing that went into it is that it was a very hard decision for him. It was personally hard. There are stories of him sitting up at night in his study, tortured, his mind being tortured. It came during that time when his daughter died. It also marked his first big break with his colleagues. So it sort of defined his career ever since. He went from being a cooperative justice under the then Chief Justice Morrison Wade, who believed in consensus on the court, was something of a mentor to Harlan in his early years on the court, being essentially the great dissenter that we write about today. That was his big break. And I think that, it was, whatever psychic cost there was in breaking with your colleagues on the biggest case, the most highly publicized case of the time, that's when it was all visited on Harlan.
Remarkable. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. It's now 7:30, but this has been a wonderful evening for us, the two centers at King's, all the students at King's who are in the audience. So I'd like to thank you warmly, Peter, for giving this talk and for taking our questions. We all wish you great success with this book. We're certain that many other people are going to be asking you the rest of this year and next year to be speaking on the book. So much success to you as you share your knowledge about this great Supreme Court justice with audiences across the country. So thank you so much. And thank you to my colleague, Paul Glatter. And thank you to everyone in the audience. A very stimulating evening for all of us. So
Thank
I'll
you
say
so
good night.
much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.